Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're gonna cover PKCE, also pronounced as PKCE, for securing our MVC and JavaScript client. First of all, let's start with the MVC client because it is more straightforward to implement it there. So what we'll need to do, and first of all, I'll make a few conscious decisions. Since I am in development, I am just going to go in my startup and I will disable the database operational flows because for development it's a little bit easier to use the in-memory ones. Okay, and I will also go into my program CS since I don't want to be seeding anything here, so I will disable that as well with the comments. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and close both of those files, and I'll go into my configuration, and for my MVC client what I will do is I'll just type in PKCE and select the require PKCE option and set it to true. If you hover over it, you will see that by default it's set to false. Now this will basically configure Identity Server to try to use the PKCE flow, which is essentially a generation of a verification code before the initial request to authenticate is done, and then when we trade in our authorization code for the tokens, that verification code is sent out as well. Now this is not so important for the MVC client. This has mostly been advised for the native applications, but recently it's also been advised for your JavaScript clients, and that will be the primary focus of implementing it there, and explanation will take place there. But just to cover that the MVC client supports this as well by default. And if we go to our MVC client startup, we will go into the config, and what we will do here is we will type in PKC and we'll get the use PKC option. We can set it to true, but this is not required because if we hover over it, we can see that it is actually enabled to default by true. So we can go ahead and leave this option out. Now let's go ahead and start this up, and essentially what you will see is that nothing will really change here. Alright, so we're on our homepage, and I haven't actually disabled the what's called persistent grant service extraction since we don't have that in our middleware anymore. It has errored, so let me just disable that and restart the application. Okay, so let's just quickly go to home/secret. Here we are. We log in, password Bob. We're back here on our client and we're on the secret page. Okay, so as I said, not much has changed. It is pretty much used by default under the covers, and because already the MVC client is sort of the bulk of it is on the server, and we can assume that the secret is secured there, and on the native application or a browser application the secret is not secured, so it's not so important for the MVC client. Now let's go ahead and proceed to the JavaScript client. So if you remember, the JavaScript client, what it will essentially do is it will redirect to the identity server, and once it's successful, it will come back with the ID token and the access token in the URL. And the addition of PKCE, what will allow us to do is essentially receive something similar to an authorization code, but again in our URL. And same as we required PKCE here, we will want to do the same thing here. So let's go ahead and require PKCE, set it to true. And one thing, because now we're not going to be requesting a token and an access token, so ID token and access token, we don't need that. We will change this to grant types code. It will still be using implicit flow, but this is just the type of data that we're going to receive back. We're going to receive back a code, but the flow is still implicit. Okay, so we've set these two options. Another thing that's required with the code flow are sort of your client secrets, the way we do with the MVC client. Now what we do for this is we go ahead and we say that required client secret, we set that to false. And now essentially this is configured to handle PKCE. Now what we have to do is we have to go to our JavaScript client and configure it there. So first of all, let's go into our main.js, and here where we essentially say that we want to receive an ID token and an access token in the response, we have to set it to code instead. And the rest of it, you don't have to worry about it. The library to which we're passing this configuration, the OIDC client library, will handle this all on its own. Another thing we will need to do is in our sign-in, we will have to provide a response mode parameter to essentially grab the code from the query, the URL query. So we go ahead and say response underscore mode and assign it to query. Okay, so not a lot of setup. The more confusing part, or I guess the more clarifying part of this, will be when we run the application and see what happens. So here we are in the browser. Let's go ahead and call the API. Make sure that it's a 401 and that the error response that we get is login required, right? So I'm not signed in and there is no session on the identity server. We're going to check the application for the local storage, if anything's stored there, and it's not. And now what I want to do is actually look at the network tab, and I'm going to keep my preserve logs on. And once we go through the sign-in process, we're then going to take a look at what has happened, right? And not the sign out button. Let me just go ahead and clear that. Let's sign in. I'll take Bob, password, and I will sign in. Okay, so here I'm back on the client. It may seem like not much has changed, but the primary goal of PKCE is to change the way that you obtain your ID and access token. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look. When we get back to the sign-in page, this is when we essentially, before this is when we got our ID and access token, right? So this is the sign-in page. And if we scroll to the bottom here, we will now see that instead of getting the ID and access token back, we actually have just a code. And this is similar to the authorization code in the sense that later on, in between the sign-in and when we return to the index page, which is where we are now, we make a request to the token endpoint, right? So before we do that, we load the OIDC client, which then loads the well-known endpoint. So then we know where to request the token from, and then we make the token request. And this is essentially, if we scroll down here, this is where we pass the code that we received on the sign-in here, on the redirect back from the identity server. We pass it in the post request here. And also part of the PKCE flow, this code verifier gets passed as well in this post request. Now this code verifier is the code that I mentioned that gets generated before we go to the identity server. So when we click the sign in button, code verifier is generated and we go to the identity server, we authenticate, and then we come back to the client. To the sign in page, we post the code verifier, that gives us our ID token and access token, and then we're back at the index page. And these two user info calls are essentially similar to how for the MVC client, we didn't want to pass all the claims in the ID token. We make a second request to get the user information. But this is not related to PKCE. So what is this code verifier, and how does the server know anything about it? So, how is it proof? So when we make a request to log in, so let's take a look at the authorization request, and we will have a code challenge here. And this is essentially a base 64 a SHA-256 encrypted version of the code verifier. So OIDC client JS library grabs our not this one, grabs our code verifier, hashes it with SHA-256, and when we make the initial authorization request, it passes as a code challenge parameter, and it also specifies the algorithm. If your library can't encrypt with the SHA-256, what it will essentially do, you can just pass in the code verifier itself here. All right. And again, this is going to be described in the articles. I'm going to link in the description. If you want to know a little bit more about it from the official releasers of this flow, go ahead in the description and check it out. But essentially, this is how it knows it. So this is a code verifier. Essentially, this code challenge is the code verifier, but encrypted. So then it decrypts it, and then when we make the token, it will essentially know how to compare this to the code challenge that we passed to the identity server initially. So this is how it knows how to tie it together, and by the end we will end up with us having the ID token and access token, and we will be able to call the API. Okay, and this is essentially it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comment section. Don't forget to join the Discord server, and as always, see you in my other episodes.